Nobody ever asked them, do you regret having lied to Oprah Winfrey? Do you regret having lied on Netflix and all the magazine interviews? Don't you see?
Meghan Markle's latest story was meant to close an uncomfortable chapter and restore control over a narrative that had followed her for years. But within hours, one detail began attracting attention, and Tom Bauer believed it revealed far more than a simple mistake. Meghan spoke with the calm certainty of someone delivering the final version of events. Her words sounded measured, personal, and carefully chosen. She described a painful royal episode as though she were finally placing the last piece into a puzzle the public had misunderstood for years. There was emotion in her voice, but there was also control. Every pause seemed deliberate. Every explanation appeared designed to settle an old dispute once and for all. This was not simply another interview. It was an attempt to reshape public memory. Meghan was no longer only defending what she had done, she was redefining why she had done it. The new account presented her as a woman who had endured pressure behind palace doors while being denied the freedom to explain what was truly happening. It softened earlier contradictions, placed greater responsibility on the institution, and suggested that the full story had remained hidden because powerful people preferred silence. But the more carefully the account was examined, the less settled it appeared. The timing had shifted. The location was described differently. Even the emotional meaning of the encounter had changed. In one telling, the moment had seemed sudden and deeply personal. In the newest version, it appeared connected to a longer series of warnings and private discussions. None of these differences seemed explosive alone. Together, however, they raised a dangerous question. Which version had been true from the beginning? Inside media offices, the reaction was cautious. Few commentators wanted to accuse Meghan directly. Instead, producers began quietly reopening old files. Previous interviews were replayed. Parcast remarks were transcribed. Legal statements were compared with comments made by friends and unnamed sources. The same royal episode appeared repeatedly, but the details refused to remain still. Harry's position only made the tension harder to ignore. Publicly, he remained beside Meghan, reinforcing the image of a couple united against years of palace pressure. Yet his earlier descriptions of that period did not fully match her new account. His timeline placed certain conversations elsewhere. His recollections suggested he had known things Meghan now implied were hidden from them both. For the first time, the united story showed a faint division. Tom Bauer did not respond immediately. He watched. He listened. Then he began studying Meghan's language, not only the details she emphasized, but the details she suddenly avoided. To Bauer, the interview sounded less like a spontaneous confession and more like a carefully prepared defense against an allegation the public had not yet heard. That was the central problem. Meghan needed the story to feel raw and deeply personal, yet every sentence seemed built to protect her from something still hidden. Bauer believed the contradiction was not accidental. He believed it pointed toward a private palace confrontation Meghan had spent years trying to control. And as old interviews were placed beside Meghan's newest account, the first crack appeared not in what she had added, but in the one crucial detail she no longer mentioned. At first, the omission seemed harmless, a forgotten name. An altered sequence, a moment retold through emotion rather than precision. But when investigators reconstructed the timeline, the missing detail placed Meghan somewhere she had previously insisted she had never been. Her earlier account had described the confrontation as sudden, private, almost impossible to prepare for. Meghan had presented herself as walking into a royal encounter without warning, only to discover that decisions had already been made around her. That sense of being blindsided became one of the most powerful parts of her story. But the new version suggested something very different. This time, Meghan appeared to acknowledge that palace aides had spoken to her beforehand. They had tried to explain what was coming, what would be expected, and which lines could not be crossed. If that warning had taken place, then the confrontation was no longer an unexpected ambush. It became the final stage of a dispute that had already begun behind closed doors. That difference changed everything. According to the emerging account, a confidential palace briefing had circulated before the event. It reportedly covered protocol, seating arrangements, speaking order, and subjects that were not to be discussed publicly. The language was formal, but the message was clear. Every person involved had been told where they would stand, what role they would play, and what must remain private. Then came the detail that drew the most attention. Meghan's newest wording appeared to echo phrases allegedly used in that briefing. The resemblance suggested she may have remembered more of the palace's warnings than she had previously admitted. A former communications aide now became crucial. The aide was said to have kept careful notes after tense meetings, recording who attended, what was discussed, and how each person responded. The aide had never spoken publicly. Yet fragments of those records were believed to have circulated among senior advisors who feared that private events might one day be retold differently. Harry's recollections only deepened the uncertainty. In one version, he claimed he learned of the dispute after Meghan became upset. In another, he seemed to accept that they had discussed the issue before the event. One memory protected the image of surprise. The other suggested preparation. For Meghan, admitting that she had been warned carried a serious cost. It weakened the picture of complete isolation that later became central to her explanation of royal life. It suggested that palace officials had not simply abandoned her. They had tried, however coldly, to prepare her. The palace remained silent, not because the contradiction lacked importance, but because correcting it would require private documents, confidential advice, and names that officials had spent years protecting. Bauer saw something even darker. The timeline was not the real scandal. The warning was. The timeline was beginning to collapse, but behind it lay a far more dangerous question. What had the palace feared Meghan might say? And why had senior figures moved to stop her? Long before Meghan's newest interview, a warning had reportedly passed through the palace in language so cautious that few understood its true meaning. It was not about clothing, etiquette, or ceremony. It concerned a private promise involving Harry, money, and their future outside Britain. By then, the dispute was allegedly no longer about whether Meghan could adapt to royal life. It was about whether she and Harry were already imagining something entirely different, a new position that would allow them to keep royal status while gaining private income, international influence, and far greater control over the media. To Meghan and Harry, it may have seemed like freedom without complete separation. To senior courtiers, it looked like a direct challenge to the monarchy's unwritten rules. Working royals could not choose the duties they wanted, reject the restrictions they disliked, and then privately profit from the prestige of the crown. The institution depended on discipline. Once one couple created a separate model, every future royal could demand the same. That was why the warning carried such force. During a tense private meeting, Meghan was allegedly told that discussions about possible commercial opportunities had already reached palace attention. The message was not presented as an accusation, but it felt like one. Meghan reportedly saw it as proof that her relationships were being watched, her independence was being restricted, and blame was already being prepared for Harry's growing frustration. Behind the formal language, a hidden rivalry was taking shape. Some members of the royal household reportedly believed Meghan was building a separate court around herself and Harry, one supported by loyal advisors, international contacts, and a public message that could compete with the palace itself. What Meghan considered protection, they considered a rival power base. Harry stood in the middle. He wanted to defend his wife, but he also understood what open resistance could cost. security arrangements, patronages, official roles, family funding, and his relationship with Queen Elizabeth II could all be placed at risk. Every path seemed to demand a sacrifice. That confrontation would later become central to Meghan's account of feeling trapped. Yet Tom Bower believed the story had been stripped of its financial and strategic context. In the version given to the public, the warning appeared deeply personal. In Bower's interpretation, it had also been about power, money, and the terms of royal independence. A senior royal was said to have offered a compromise: fewer public duties, a private retreat, and time to reconsider before any permanent announcement. But the proposal failed. Meghan reportedly feared that delay would allow palace officials to seize control of the story and define why they were leaving before she could speak for herself. And somewhere inside that meeting, one person had written everything down. Bower believed those notes could challenge not only Meghan's latest wording, but the emotional foundation of the story itself. But the warning itself was only half the secret. Someone inside the room had recorded what Meghan said in response, and Tom Bower was preparing to reveal why those words changed everything. Tom Bower's response did not begin with outrage. It began with a date, a documented meeting, and one sentence Meghan had apparently spoken behind palace doors. That sentence directly contradicted her newest story and suggested she had known the consequences long before claiming she was shocked. According to Bower's account, the meeting took place before the confrontation Meghan later described as sudden and devastating. She was not alone. Harry was reportedly beside her as palace officials explained what would happen if the couple tried to create a semi-independent role, keeping royal privileges while pursuing private income, international influence, and commercial freedom. The warning was direct. They could remain working royals under established rules, or they could step away and accept the consequences. What they could not do, officials allegedly insisted, was create a separate monarchy built around their own terms. That meeting shattered the latest version of Meghan's story. Her new account implied that leaving Britain had not yet become a serious possibility. She presented the crisis as something forced upon them later, after trust had collapsed. But Bower alleged that North America, independent representation, and future commercial opportunities were already being discussed. Then came the sentence that changed the meaning of everything. Meghan reportedly warned that if the palace refused their preferred arrangement, she and Harry would tell their own story publicly. If true, those words were devastating. They suggested that the interviews which followed were not simply emotional confessions made after an unexpected betrayal. They may have been the fulfillment of a strategy first raised behind closed doors, a warning transformed into action when negotiations failed. Bower compared three accounts: Meghan's original public version, Harry's later recollection, and Meghan's newly revised description. Each one moved the timeline. Each shifted responsibility. Each changed who first considered leaving and when the decision became real. To Bower, this was not ordinary confusion. He argued that the story evolved whenever new information threatened the version that came before it. For Harry, the contradiction created an impossible choice. Supporting Meghan meant stepping away from parts of his own account. Correcting her would suggest a fracture in the united image they had spent years defending. Silence protected the marriage publicly, but it allowed suspicion to grow. Inside palace circles, the reaction was controlled but intense. Former aides reportedly felt vindicated. Senior officials, however, resisted releasing private records. Those documents could expose sensitive conversations involving the late Queen, Charles, William, and staff members who had never agreed to become part of a public battle. But Bower's final claim made the story even more dangerous. He suggested Meghan's altered account was protecting more than her credibility. It may also have concealed the advisor who first convinced the couple that a public confrontation could force the palace to surrender. The contradiction had finally been exposed, But Bauer's revelation opened a more explosive mystery who had convinced Meghan and Harry that challenging the palace would strengthen their power rather than destroy it. Behind every public rupture stood a private voice, someone who understood celebrity, media pressure, and the financial value of royal conflict. According to Bauer's account, Meghan was not acting alone, and the advice she received may have transformed a family dispute into a global confrontation. The advisor was never placed at the center of the story. That may have been the point. Operating outside palace walls, this figure allegedly encouraged Meghan and Harry to stop treating royal restrictions as fixed rules. They were obstacles, the couple was told, obstacles that could be weakened if enough public pressure was applied. The argument was dangerously persuasive. Harry and Meghan had international recognition, intense media interest, and an audience far beyond Britain. The advisor allegedly convinced them that the monarchy needed their popularity more than they needed the institution. That belief gave them leverage, or so they thought, to demand greater control over security, titles, status, money, and their future. Slowly, Meghan's language began to change. Private frustration became strategy. Conversations once focused on duty and family shifted toward branding, ownership, global influence, personal storytelling, and the long-term value of independence. Royal life was no longer discussed only as an emotional burden. It was also treated as something whose power could be carried into a new world. Harry was especially vulnerable to this message. He already distrusted the press and believed Meghan was being hunted by the same forces that had tormented his mother. Each warning from palace officials seemed to confirm his worst fear, that the institution would protect itself before protecting the people inside it. According to Bauer's interpretation, the outside advisor understood this pain and used it. The couple were allegedly told that compromise would come only when the royal family feared public damage. Private negotiation would not be enough. The palace had to believe silence carried a greater cost than surrender. That may explain why the couple's most powerful claims were eventually delivered to the world instead of resolved within the family. It also explains the shifting story. Each revised account answered a new criticism while preserving the central message. Harry and Meghan had been forced into every decision. Admitting they had received strategic guidance would complicate that image. It would suggest planning where the public had been shown panic, and calculation where they had been shown survival. Inside their royal office, trust began to collapse. Some aides feared they were being asked to support plans never approved by the Queen. Others worried that decisions made outside official channels would later be blamed on palace staff. Meetings grew shorter. Notes became longer. Every conversation was recorded with greater care because officials feared private words might one day return in a different form. The palace's deepest concern was no longer simply that Harry and Meghan might leave. It was what they could take with them: royal access, private knowledge, old wounds, and the power to turn unresolved family pain into a global business. And when the palace realized how much private history could follow Harry and Meghan out of Britain, a quiet decision was made, one that would turn negotiation into permanent exile. Publicly, the separation was described as a search for freedom. Privately, the negotiations became a brutal argument over money, protection, titles, inheritance, and access. Every privilege carried a condition, and every condition forced Harry to choose between the monarchy and Meghan's new future. Once Harry and Meghan confirmed that they intended to step back, the emotional battle became an institutional one. Palace officials were no longer discussing hurt feelings or damaged relationships. They were deciding which royal benefits could follow the couple into private life, and which had to remain tied to service. Security became one of the most bitter disputes. Harry believed protection was inseparable from who he was. He had been born into public danger, pursued by the press, and raised under threats he had never chosen. To him, stepping away from duty did not remove the risk. Officials saw it differently. Publicly funded protection depended on active responsibilities, location, and government assessment. Birth alone could not guarantee every privilege forever. Then came the question of money. Private inheritance was separate from official funding, yet Harry reportedly feared financial pressure would become a weapon. If support could be reduced whenever he resisted palace demands, freedom would exist only in name. Meghan shared that suspicion. She believed dependence allowed the institution to control their home, their staff, their access, and ultimately, their future. Titles carried an even deeper meaning. Harry and Meghan wanted to preserve the royal identity that connected them to history and gave their new life international weight. The palace feared those same titles could be used to secure commercial agreements far beyond royal oversight. At the center of the struggle stood the late Queen. She loved Harry as her grandson, but she also understood the danger of creating a special arrangement. If one royal could retain full status while operating independently, others might demand the same. Affection could not be allowed to rewrite the structure of the crown. Charles faced a different torment. Supporting Harry privately risked appearing to reward public defiance. Cutting him off could confirm the accusation that his family had abandoned him at his most vulnerable. Yet in Meghan's newest account, these financial and commercial negotiations were pushed into the background. The departure appeared driven almost entirely by emotional mistreatment. That version was more painful, more personal, and easier for the public to understand. Bauer argued that it was also incomplete. The conflict had never been only about suffering. It was about the price of independence, the limits of royal identity, and whether Harry and Meghan could leave the institution without surrendering the power it had given them. Then the palace made one final decision. It was quiet, symbolic, and impossible for Harry to ignore. The financial settlement had narrowed their choices, but it was the palace's next decision, quiet, symbolic, and deeply personal, that transformed Harry's disappointment into open retaliation. Harry believed one relationship could still protect him from total separation. But when his final private request was refused, the message felt unmistakable: the institution would survive without him. What followed was not simply anger, it was a campaign to make the palace feel his absence. According to the accounts surrounding the negotiations, Harry wanted an agreement that would preserve direct access to the Queen whenever he returned to Britain. No layers of courtiers. No carefully controlled schedules. No need to seek formal approval before speaking privately with his grandmother. To Harry, this was not a demand for power. It was a plea to protect the one bond he believed still existed beyond titles and duty. Palace officials saw danger. An informal conversation with the monarch could later be described as permission, support, or even a promise. Without advisors present, there would be no agreed record of what had been said. A private exchange could quickly become a constitutional problem, especially if Harry used it to strengthen future demands involving security, status, or royal access. The request was refused. Harry took the decision personally. He believed senior advisors were placing barriers between him and the Queen, controlling not only royal business, but the possibility of reconciliation itself. Every condition felt like another lock on a door that had once been open. Meghan saw something even darker. To her, the rejection proved that family relationships inside the monarchy were never truly private. Love existed beneath protocol, but protocol always came first. Every conversation could be scheduled, witnessed, recorded, and controlled whenever the institution felt threatened. For Harry, the emotional cost was enormous. He had already surrendered military roles, public duties, royal responsibilities, and the familiar home that had connected him to Britain. Losing direct access to his grandmother made the separation feel permanent. After that, the couple's media strategy hardened. Interviews, documentaries, speeches, and written accounts became more than platforms for explanation. They became tools for reclaiming influence outside palace control. If Harry could not reach his family privately, he could force them to hear him publicly. Bower believed each revelation served two purposes. It defended the couple's departure, but it also pressured the monarchy to react. The palace refused. A detailed response could expose family arguments, security assessments, staff records, private health matters, or confidential conversations involving the Queen. Silence protected the institution. Yet, it also gave Meghan room to refine her account without facing a complete official rebuttal. That silence placed growing pressure on the marriage. Harry became the witness expected to confirm Meghan's version. Meghan became the person required to defend the decision that had carried Harry further from his family. Now, Bower's exposure threatened more than one interview. It placed every future revelation under suspicion. And as the newest contradiction spread, the question was no longer whether Meghan's account had changed it, was whether the public would ever trust another revelation from inside her royal past. One contradiction rarely destroys a public figure. But a pattern can. As Meghan's newest story collided with earlier interviews, Harry's recollections, and Bower's allegations, the battle moved beyond royal history. It became a fight over who would control the truth forever. The credibility crisis formed almost immediately. Meghan's supporters argued that memory is not a perfect record. Trauma, pressure, and the passage of time can change how painful events are understood. To them, small differences did not prove deception. They revealed how deeply the experience had affected her. Critics saw something else. To them, the story did not merely evolve emotionally. Important facts moved with it. Dates changed. Warnings became surprises. Discussions that once appeared to happen later now seemed to have begun much earlier. Each alteration made the account more sympathetic, but also more difficult to defend. Tom Bower gained strength from every discrepancy. He positioned himself as the person willing to ask questions that friendly interviewers had supposedly ignored. The more Meghan revised her account, the easier it became for him to argue that her version survived only because it had never faced sustained pressure. Meghan now faced a dangerous choice. Silence could allow Bower's claims to dominate, yet a detailed response might create fresh contradictions or expose private material she had previously chosen to protect. Every explanation risked opening another door. Harry's position was even more painful. He could support Meghan's latest version and weaken his own earlier recollections. He could correct her and fuel speculation about division inside their marriage, or he could remain silent and allow the public to wonder why he was no longer defending the story with the same force. The royal family understood the power of that silence. By refusing to argue point by point, the palace left Meghan and Bower fighting over a history that could not be fully settled without confidential records. The institution appeared distant, but distance protected it. Meghan had to keep speaking. The palace did not. That imbalance could follow her into every future project. Interviews, memoirs, documentaries, podcasts, and personal revelations would no longer be judged alone. Each claim would be compared with every version that came before it. The private cost was heavier. Meghan may have felt trapped by words spoken during anger, fear, and isolation. Harry may have begun to realize that every new defense of their departure carried him further from reconciliation. This was the final irony. Meghan had left royal life partly to control her own voice, but repeated retellings had made that voice more vulnerable to dates, documents, and comparison. Then Bower introduced one last threat. The meeting may have produced more than notes. A second witness was said to possess correspondence, revealing when the exit plans truly began, and what the couple intended to demand. Because if that correspondence is ever revealed, Meghan's changing story may no longer be the greatest scandal, the real shock may be how early the final royal rupture had been planned.